Hello everyone, a warm welcome to today's Exploring Research event, Girding the Loins. I'm Elma Brenner and I'm a Research Development Specialist here at Wellcome Collection, and I'll be chairing this session. My pronouns are she, her, and as a brief audio description, I have red hair, I'm wearing brown glasses and a black patterned top. I'm sitting in the forum, one of our event spaces here at Wellcome Collection, on a blue chair with a large screen behind me. For those of you not familiar with us, Wellcome Collection is a free museum and library that aims to challenge how we all think and feel about health by connecting science, medicine, life, and art. Our Exploring Research programme is just one of many types of event that we offer. Today, we'll be discussing the findings of recent research on a medieval parchment birthing girdle, Wellcome Collection MS632. We're going to learn about the historical and cultural context for this remarkable object, and we'll hear about the scientific investigation of stains in this manuscript that has provided new evidence for how it was actually used by people in the past. We've produced a video of the manuscript in connection with this event. We'll be posting a link to this video in the moderator chat and after the event as well. Manuscript 632 is one of 3 medieval birth girdles that we hold here at Wellcome Collection. We're not able to have it in the room with us here today because it's currently being exhibited in Berlin in an exhibition at the Gropius Bau entitled Care, Repair, Heal. It's being displayed in connection with a work by contemporary artist Johanna Hedfer entitled The Clock is Always Wrong, exploring different scales of time. And we're really excited that it's being displayed there. We do, however, have one of our 2 other birth girdles on display here in the room, and those of you who are here with us in person are able to see it. It's manuscript 804A, and it's a French roll produced in circa 1485 that reflects the cult of St. Margaret of Antioch. So before we get started, I'm going to briefly run through how we'll run the events. So some of us are here in person at Wellcome Collection, but the event is also being live streamed, and it will be available to watch again on Wellcome Collection's YouTube channel. Hello to our live stream audience. Your cameras and microphones will be off, but hopefully you can see us and hear us. We have live speech-to-text provided by VoiceBox. If you're in the room, you can see the captions to the left of me here, and the online attendees can see them in the live stream. This is an interactive event, and we'd love to hear from you. The event is just over an hour long, and we have presentations by our 2 speakers, who I'll be delighted to introduce in a moment. If you're here in person, please raise your hand once the 2 speakers have finished their talks, and we will hand you a microphone. And if you'd rather not ask verbally, or be heard by the online live stream audience, or in the recording, please speak to a member of staff after the event to pose your question, and we will pass that on. For those of you who are online, you can chat, comment, and ask questions in the Q&A throughout in the YouTube chat. The Wellcome Collection chat moderator will compile the questions that we have time for and pass them to a member of staff in the room who will ask on your behalf. Please note that you do need to be signed into YouTube to chat there. So of course, today we want everyone to have a positive experience, and we want to create a safe space for people to share their ideas and thoughts. So please interact in person or online responsibly and respectfully. If you're online and struggling with the platform or have any questions, please comment in the chat box and our moderator will get in touch. And again, you will need to have a YouTube login to use the chat function. And now I'm really delighted to introduce our speakers for this session. So I'm going to introduce the speakers and then we'll do brief audio descriptions before going on to the talks. So I first wanted to mention that our conservator here at Wellcome Collection, Stefania Signorello, who has played a key part in this research, unfortunately isn't able to be here today. But she's provided her thoughts and comments, and I'm going to start off by sharing those with you. As well as being a book conservator here at Wellcome Collection, Stefania is also co-founder of the Book and Paper Gathering blog. I would also like to introduce here alongside me, first of all, Kierri Price, sitting here on the green chair. Kierri is a Chase-funded PhD student, jointly between Birkbeck, University of London, and Wellcome Collection. Their research is centred on the manuscripts and artefacts of late medieval England, in particular, those that focus on the protection of the body and the soul. Kierri is also co-organiser of the upcoming Gender and Medieval Studies Conference, Aftermath, Recovery, Repair, taking place in January 2023 at Birkbeck and Wellcome Collection. And Kierri, would you like to do a brief audio description?
Yes. So, my name is Kierri. I am sitting in the green chair in between Elma and Sarah. I've got dark brown hair and I'm wearing an orange top and I have grey trousers.
Thank you. That's great. And now I'm also really, really pleased to introduce Dr. Sarah Fiddyment, sitting here on the red chair. So Sarah received her BSc, MSc and PhD in biochemistry from the University of Zaragoza in Spain in the field of cardiovascular proteomics. She then held Marie Curie and British Academy postdoctoral fellowships at the University of York, looking at the proteomic analysis of parchments throughout history. And she is currently a research associate on the European Research Council funded project Beast to Craft at the University of Cambridge. And Sarah, could you give an audio description?
Yes. Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm sitting here next to Kierri in a red chair. I have short blonde hair. I'm wearing a grey jumper and black trousers.
Thank you. So before I hand over to Kierri, I just wanted to provide a bit of context on the conservation aspects of this project, provided by Stefania Signorello. So Stefania has shared that one of our key priorities here at Wellcome Collection is to make our collections as available as possible to our users, both on site and throughout the world. But when items of great research and historical value become very fragile and at high risk of damage or loss, we face a number of ethical decisions about how to provide access to them. What we tend to need to do is to arrange for them to be seen by appointment and to be handled by a conservator. This approach is cost-effective, and it also reduces or avoids altogether the need to carry out conservation treatments on the items. And this means that you can retain the items in the condition in which they survive today, which often means that features, for example, about how they were made and constructed are visible. Conservation treatment is an intervention that might obscure such details. Manuscript 632, our focus today, is a prime example of these kinds of questions. We've needed to restrict access to it for the past 10 to 15 years. Its very poor condition makes it extremely risky to open it and view it without causing further damage every time that it's unrolled and rolled up again. So we've been considering very careful questions about access. The video that we've just made with Kierri also is a wonderful way of providing access without needing to actually open up the item. But alongside these conservation considerations, conservators are passionate about enabling the continuation of learning and discovery about these items. And one example from a few years ago was when a researcher did come to see MS632 in the conservation studio. Stefania entered into conversation with the researcher, and they ended up talking about the intriguing stains on the manuscript. Stefania remembered that she was in touch with Professor Matthew Collins, a researcher who has been leading research in the field of proteomic analysis of stains, and who has worked closely with Sarah Fiddyment. And this resulted in a collaboration, which has ultimately led to the really, really exciting discoveries that we'll talk about today. So Sarah sent in a kit that enabled samples to be taken from the manuscript. And obviously this opened up further ethical considerations because taking a sample might be considered to be something destructive. But really the close collaboration here of the scientist and the conservator ensured that everyone was comfortable with this sampling technique that was the very minimal level of invasion. And I'm sure Sarah will tell us more about that. And so Stefania really wanted to conclude her intervention by saying that having found that this sampling process was taking such a tiny, tiny sample from the manuscript, she did wonder whether there would be any discoveries. And of course there were. So this was really exciting and a wonderful way of thinking about how we can preserve these objects and continue to learn from them. So that's the material that Stefania wanted to share with you today. I also want to thank Stefania for all this wonderful work that she's done in collaboration with Sarah and others. So now I'll hand over to Kierri to provide us with the context for understanding these objects. Thank you.
Thank you, Elma. Right, so I'm going to be talking today about the historical and cultural contexts of MS632, a medieval English birth girdle. There are only 9 of these that we know of that survive today. 4 of them are in libraries in America, and the other 5 are here in London. So if you happen to have one hiding at home somewhere, do please let us know. All of these birth girdles date to the end of the medieval period, at some point between 1350 and 1600. MS632 is about 500 years old, made at roughly the same time that the printing press first arrived in England. But this manuscript was made the old-fashioned way. It's all written by hand on parchment, which is specially treated animal skin. One of the birth girdles we've got is actually printed on paper, which is up on the screen now, but all the others are like MS632, handwritten on parchment. All of them have a mixture of devotional texts and images, though, even the printed one. Some of them are very rudimentary, like Harley Charter's 43A14. You're going to have a lot of these really catchy names coming up. So you can see it up on the screen now, on the left-hand side. It's all in one colour, and there's only one image, which is a fairly simplistic drawing of a cross. On the other end of the spectrum, there's another British Library manuscript, MS Additional 88929, which is much more colourful. There are images throughout the whole thing, and it uses a lot of gold leaf. Now, this manuscript was actually owned by Henry VIII before he became king, which might explain why it's such an extravagant object. So, these birth girdles could be elite, luxurious artefacts owned by very wealthy or important people, like the royal family. But over time, they would have filtered down the social scale and become available to more and more people, until you get to something like the printed birth girdle that would have been mass-produced and affordable for a much larger market. Unfortunately, we don't have much written evidence to tell us exactly who owned these birth girdles, who created them, or who used them. And the fact that there are so few surviving makes it even more of a challenge to answer these questions. But we can learn a lot about why and how they were used by looking at their historical and cultural contexts, and by doing some really detailed investigation about the content and form of these birth girdles. Okay, so let's think a little bit about the form or shape of the manuscript. MS-632 was made from several separate panels of parchment that were stitched together in order to create this roll we've got today, which is over 3 meters long. So why would you make a manuscript this shape? It's very different from an ordinary book. You can fit a lot more text into a book. It can be stored nice and neatly on a shelf. And it's also a format that's more hard-wearing, especially if it's got a hard cover. MS-632, by contrast, would have been at much greater risk of damage than your standard codex form book, since it didn't necessarily have a solid case or cover to protect it. We're actually missing the top of the manuscript, as you can see here, which is the part of the roll that would have been most exposed when it was all rolled up. A birth girdle also wouldn't have made a particularly good display object, because although it's 3 meters long, it's only 10 centimeters wide, so you'd have to get pretty close to it in order to be able to read it. If you only unrolled it part of the way, you wouldn't be able to read the text on the back properly, and if you did unroll it all the way, it could be quite a difficult thing to work with. You know what it's like when you get a really long receipt from the shops, and it just kind of curls and springs around and doesn't want to behave? A birth girdle is just as unruly. But this roll format does have some advantages that a normal book doesn't have. It can be a lot easier to navigate than a book. You don't have to remember page numbers or use a bookmark, because once you unroll it, you can see the whole thing in one go, and perhaps use the images to help you find your place. You can also roll it up to a tiny package, and it's incredibly light, so it's really easy to carry around with you. And because of its shape, there were a variety of ways that you could physically interact with it, including wrapping it around your body. And that's where we get the girdle bit of the label birth girdle. Now, this term is actually a modern one, not an original medieval term. Back then, these manuscripts were generally referred to as measures. Now, the birth part of the term can be a bit misleading, because these manuscripts weren't used exclusively during pregnancy and labour, but were available more generally for protection against a whole variety of dangers. However, birth is one of the situations where the manuscripts actually explicitly instruct you to make use of their belt-like form, and the term birth girdle emphasises that usage. In MS-632, we get an instruction that tells us if a woman is in labour, we should gird this measure about her womb, and that's up on the screen now. By doing that, this would help protect both her and the baby. Now, medieval childbirth was a very risky thing, and looked very different from how we're used to birth happening now. In the last few years, for example, home births made up only 2 to 3% of births in England and Wales, whereas it was a very different picture in late medieval Britain. Today, we're used to birth being something that happens in hospitals, in a much more clinical environment. But medieval birth would have happened in a domestic setting. Now, hospitals did exist, but they were very different from the establishments we're familiar with today. Back then, they were charitable institutions for the poor, and it was generally those who were in unstable domestic or social situations who would have found themselves in medieval birth wards. For the kinds of people who would have used a birth girdle, aristocratic or merchant class individuals, it was common practice to retire to a birthing chamber several weeks before giving birth, and that's one of the images that's up on the screen now. This room would have been dark, with soft furnishings, and would have been attended by female friends, relatives, and midwives. Midwives would have had a great deal of experience, and they were equipped to deal with most situations. Physicians and surgeons were also called upon, rarely, usually to perform emergency caesarean sections if the mother died in labour. And parish priests might also be on hand for spiritual intervention, although midwives were able to baptise newborn children if their lives were in danger. But for all that, birth remained a very dangerous thing, and that's where birth girdles came in. They were a type of protective technology, a first line of defence that could function as a preventative measure against bad outcomes. They're all explicitly Christian in their content, and the prayers and images they contained gave you a more direct channel of communication to God and the saints, who might be able to step in and protect you from danger. For example, in MS Additional 88929, the Henry VIII birth girdle, we get a series of images of different saints. Each image comes along with some text that tells us a bit about the saint, and then some prayers we can say to get that saint's intervention. The final one on this manuscript, a section about Saint Armel, who's up on the screen now, even gives us a really clear description of what he's best at. It says, "All those who pray to God and Saint Armel shall be delivered from all these sicknesses, including sores, aches, fevers, and the pox." The Wellcome Birth Girdle, which is on the right of the screen, doesn't have the same abundance of images, but it does reference a number of saints in its text. Quiricus and Julitta, who were mother and son martyrs, particularly known for their help in childbirth, and a number of others, such as Mary, Anne, Catherine, Margaret, Dorothea, and Barbara, all of whom were well established as saints who could help in dangerous situations. As for what kinds of situations the birth girdles could be useful in, one of the texts that we can find in the manuscripts is called The Great Gifts. It gives us a list of some of the things they could help protect against. Everything from sudden death and poisoning through to disease and wicked spirits. But how are you meant to access these promised benefits? Well, there's one thing that medieval devotional culture really loves: interaction. You weren't just expected to sit there passively and somehow absorb divine favour. It was all about getting involved. Saying prayers, going on pilgrimage, physically interacting with paintings and sculptures of holy figures. All of these are legitimate forms of devotion, and they all require you to put in some kind of effort, which is exactly how the birth girdles work. There are instructions to follow, such as saying a particular number of prayers, looking at a particular image, or using the manuscript physically in some way. There's a great example in Harley Roll T11, another British Library manuscript. We get an image of the 3 nails, accompanied by the Great Gifts text, which tells us that you can get all of these benefits in exchange for bearing the length of these nails upon yourself and devoutly worshipping the 3 nails with a certain number of prayers. Then, a bit lower down, there's this beautiful stylistic representation of Christ's side wound, which is on the right. It's a series of concentric diamonds, with each one getting a darker pigment as we move towards the centre, which kind of gives it a sense of depth. Some text tells us, if you carry this measure of the blessed wound with you, it can protect you from a whole host of perils: battle, weapons, fire, water, storms, and labour. So this is a fairly low effort transaction, if you will. All you have to do is carry this image with you, and in return, you're protected. But it looks like someone might have interacted with this image in a different way as well. So can you see how the centre of this diamond is more faded and worn away than the rest of it? Something that's quite common in medieval devotion is for people to touch or even kiss holy images such as this one. The way it gets referred to in this manuscript as a measure of Christ's wound tells us that it's more than just a nice picture. It's designed to be a to-scale representation of the side wound, and its accuracy helps give it a more direct link to Jesus, and therefore gives it more power as an image. The same kind of thing holds true in MS 632. So here's another image of the side wound. Notice that it's rotated 90 degrees. This time it's got the hands and feet of Christ spread out around it, and you can see these ribbon-like blood droplets underneath. The text that goes along with it is a verse prayer on the number of the drops of blood that spilled at Christ's crucifixion. But it's also a bit of a test for your mental arithmetic. 500,000 plus 47,000 plus another 500. Once again, you've got to put some kind of effort in. Mental effort this time. You've got to add up the numbers yourself. And the number that you end up with has a certain protective power to it. This fascination with measurement and numeration pops up across the different birth girdles, as well as in lots of other devotional manuscripts. Now, if you think about the idea of pilgrimage, where people go to visit a shrine that might be at a holy location or might have a relic of a saint, it makes sense that people would want to be close to a place or object that was associated with a holy person. And it's the same thing with these holy measurements. By drawing the side wound to scale, or giving us a poem about the exact number of blood droplets, or even making a birth girdle that's the same length as the Virgin Mary was tall, we end up with an object that has something of the original holy person about it. Now, I can't speak for divine intervention, whether these birth girdles actually worked to give people a special fast-track connection to God or a saint. But we can see that birth girdles could have had some very real impacts on anxiety, stress, and panic in dangerous situations, which may well have influenced outcomes. By making protection a kind of transactional thing, something that demanded your interaction in exchange for a good result, the birth girdles gave you agency in directing your fate. We can even see some similarities to modern therapeutic techniques. Reciting prayers can help you regulate your breathing. Instructions to repeat particular devotional actions could induce a sort of meditative state. And wrapping a birth girdle around your body might be a kind of grounding exercise, helping you create a connection between your mind, your body, and your environment. And knowing that these manuscripts often had a history of use by several people or over several generations, using a birth girdle meant tapping into this community and not feeling so alone. There was clearly a cultural need for the sort of protection that the birth girdles offered. Otherwise, why would they even exist? Now, I can't give you statistics for successful outcomes with or without birth girdles, but hopefully what I can offer you is a little bit of an insight into the everyday lives and emotional experiences of people from half a millennium ago. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kierri. That was a wonderful introduction to these objects and a consideration of their place in late medieval culture and people's experiences of health, and of how they functioned and how they were, used and how people related to them. That I think it sets us up incredibly well to then hand over to Sarah to talk about the research that she has conducted on MS632.
Thank you, Elma. So I'm going to start with a word that many of you probably have not heard of before, which is biocode ecology. So this is a term that we have coined to encompass the study of the biomolecular information that forms part of the biological history of a manuscript object. So in here you can see some of the examples of the information that we're talking about, things like the DNA, the proteins, or even the microbial communities that can live on the surface of the object. Now, in this particular study for the birth girdle, we're going to be focusing only on the proteins. Now, when you want to approach a biocode ecological study, the first thing you need to think about is your sampling method. Now, because we are talking about incredibly precious objects, there is not really an option for a physical destructive sample. We do not want to be cutting pieces off valuable objects. So we have to think of different ways that we can actually go about sampling to extract the biomolecules that we're interested in. So in order to do this, I worked very closely with conservators to develop a non-invasive form of sampling. We looked at various methodologies that conservators use to routinely clean parchment when necessary for exhibits or for handling. And when looking at these different methodologies, we came across one which basically involved using the waste product from a cleaning method, using PVC erasers. So conservators will sometimes use conventional PVC erasers to surface clean parchment to remove the dirt. But what we did was collect these tiny little fragments of eraser, the ones that you normally blow away once you've just finished rubbing out your pencil. We collect those little fragments of eraser, and it's from there that we can extract our biomolecules, both proteins and, we later found out, DNA. And this is based on a technique called triboelectric extraction, which is effectively a static interaction, just like the one with a balloon when you rub it on your hair and your hair pulls up. Effectively, these erasers are on the surface of the parchment, and all of the proteins get trapped in these little eraser fragments, in these little eraser crumbs in the same way. We collect these little crumbs in a tiny little plastic vial, and then we take them to our lab for the extraction. It's a very simple process. It's one that the conservators are very confident in doing because it's a process that they're used to, and it requires no special storage or methodology, just an eraser. So we were approached, as Elma mentioned before, by Stefania here at the Wellcome to look at this incredibly interesting object, manuscript MS632. Initially, we had thought to target purely the 4 pieces of parchment to identify animal origin, but then we started to think about what else we could do with it. So what can we do with our eraser crumbs once we have them? There are 2 main analyses that we can carry out from this protein aspect. The first one is e-zooms, or single protein analysis. Here what we're looking at is only one specific protein, and in this case it's the protein collagen. Now, you may have heard of collagen. It's the major component of skin. It's the major protein in skin. And of course, parchment is nothing more than treated animal skins. So it is made predominantly of collagen. And by analysing that one specific protein, we can identify the species of origin of the parchment. Calf, sheep, goat, for example. The name e-zooms comes from electrostatic zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry. It's a bit of a mouthful, which is why we call it e-zooms. And it basically involves our electrostatic methodology using our PVC erasers, collecting our crumbs from the surface of the parchment. We then put these into a saline solution, basically to dissolve off the proteins from the crumbs into solution. And then we use another protein called trypsin to cut up our collagen into smaller fragments, because collagen is very, very long, so we need to cut it into smaller fragments. We then separate these fragments out using mass spectrometry, which is the part at the end. By using mass spectrometry, we measure the masses of these little fragments of protein. They're also called peptides. And what you get is, for each specific animal, so each species of animal has its own collection of peptides, effectively a fingerprint, which is why the technique is called peptide mass fingerprinting. By having a database of different animals, we can then compare our sample to these known fingerprints and then get to the eventual identification of the species of animal used for the parchment. So in the case of the birth girdle, we started off with this technique. We sampled each of the 4 individual pieces of parchment that are used to make the girdle. And in all 4 cases, we were able to identify the parchment as becoming from sheep. It was sheepskin parchment. Now, this makes sense for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because sheepskin tends to be thinner and more pliable, so it's actually easier to fold and to manipulate than other species, which would be an ideal material for a birth girdle. It's also much cheaper, well, comparatively cheaper than calfskin parchment from documentary evidence that we have. And also there is a lot of sheepskin parchment in England due to the wool economy, so it's an easy to find material. Once we'd done this initial analysis and talking more with Stefania, we decided to think, could we go a step further and not only look at the animal origin of the parchment, but can we look at some of these stains and these obvious uses of wear that appear on the birth girdle? Could we actually use our technique to give us a little bit more information about possibly what was on there? And for that, we needed to do a proteomic analysis. That starts to take into account not just one protein, collagen, like before, but rather all the other proteins that might be present on the surface of the document. In order to carry out the proteomic analysis, we use exactly the same methodology as we have done previously for e-zooms. The only difference is that we use a more sophisticated method of mass spectrometry, and this is able to actually separate and identify different types of protein. So here you can see a summary of the results from the birth girdle. So you can see in the first column labeled WT, those are the results from the birth girdle. And you can see that compared to our blank and our control document, which is actually an 18th century Scottish legal document, you can see that the birth girdle has a lot more proteins just in general. There is a collection of proteins that are shared by all 3 of them. Those that are in grey are common to all 3 documents analysed. But what we can see is that the birth girdle has proteins that are only found there. There are animal proteins, plant proteins, bacterial proteins, and human proteins that we could only find on the birth girdle. So this in itself was an incredibly good result, because we could start to see that there was a lot more information there than we'd initially thought. This is to look at some of the more specific samples that we were able to identify. So in this case, we were able to identify major royal jelly protein 1, which is found in honey. So this gave us direct evidence in this particular sample for the use of honey on the object. In another case, we were able to find evidence for chicken egg. We found proteins both from the egg yolk and from the egg white. So they were using both parts. We were also able to identify milk or milk derivatives, so perhaps butter or cheese, from ovicaprine milk. So this is either sheep or goat's milk. We can't tell between the two, but we definitely can exclude cow's milk. It's either sheep or goat. We were also able to find more generally in the object evidence for various cereals. So we found evidence for oat, barley, wheat, and also some leguminous plants, things like pea and broad bean. Now you'll also see here an image of mouse, and that's because we were also able to identify proteins from mouse urine. But we think this is more to do with the history of the environment of the document and not so much a medicinal use. So all of these non-human proteins that we managed to identify have all been described in historical texts as being used as remedies or recipes to help women in either pregnancy or labour. So they all fitted in very well with the narrative of the use of the birth girdle as an actual physical object. But in addition to these non-human proteins, we were also able to identify a whole suite of human proteins. As a collection of proteins, we had to sort of compare it to different biological tissues to see what is it that we're really seeing here. It's not really good enough just to say human. So we decided to compare them to known biological tissues that might have been of interest, things like blood or amniotic fluid. But actually, when comparing them with these different tissues, the one we found that it matched best to was cervicovaginal fluid. So this would really seem to indicate that the birth girdle was being physically worn by women, probably in late pregnancy and possibly during labour. You can see here in this image some possible methods of how the girdle might have actually been worn as a sort of not just a symbolic girdle of protection, but actually as a physical girdle too. And this would give much stronger evidence that this was actually used due to all the proteins that we found on it. So before finishing, I just wanted to obviously thank my co-speakers and co-authors on this paper that we published. But I wanted to highlight the importance of interdisciplinarity in a field like biocode ecology. None of this work would have happened if we hadn't had such a close connection between the conservators, the scientists, and the manuscript scholars. It was only by talking things through, working together and helping each other that we were actually able to carry out this kind of analysis and contextualize it and make sense and provide other avenues of evidence for the scholarship that was already there. So we want to think of biocode ecology as just another tool that is there to be used by scholars from all different fields that can add more information, but also open up new avenues and new questions that maybe before couldn't have been tackled with just conventional methods. And finally, just to say, if you are interested in biocode ecology and you'd like to know a little bit more, our project and all of our open access research is in our project website, Beastcraft. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's really incredible actually thinking back over how these discoveries were made in our manuscript here at Wellcome Collection, and to think through the methods and techniques and technology that have made all of this possible. Also the kinds of things that one should be looking for in the analysis. It's also really exciting to think about what we are going to discover in the future through further research of this nature on more manuscripts, and potentially from different parts of the world, different periods of time as well. So this field will continue to grow, and as you say, more interdisciplinary collaboration will enable more of this. Thank you so much. We have time now for questions and discussion. I know that my colleague Julia will take questions within the room. If there are questions here from anyone here who'd like to ask a question or make a comment, I think Caroline's going to come round.
Turn the microphones on.
Brilliant, thank you.
Does anyone have any questions from this side?
We have one online, actually.
Great.
This one is for Sarah. Can you analyse any human DNA?
Yes and no. So potentially it's there. However, we don't routinely analyse human DNA for many reasons, partly ethical, but partly because we are more focused on the animal origins of parchment, etc., rather than human. The complication you would find is that the DNA is going to be quite degraded, and it's going to be effectively just a mixed signal of all the people that have possibly worn it or even touched it, because you will deposit very small amounts of your DNA. So to actually find anything meaningful from there, I think would be very, very complicated. So we don't routinely look at it, but obviously with the proteins, we can at least say that, you know, they are being used, which is it's actually something that with the DNA you wouldn't find out, because the DNA would only give you the profile of it's human, but it wouldn't have given you the tissue specificity that we would get with the proteins. So with the proteins, we know what tissue you're actually looking at, whereas with DNA, it would just say human. So it would actually be less informative in this case.
I actually had a linked question, just which might be just a brief one, but you mentioned a number of different proteins on MS632. Was that really noticeable? Have you looked at manuscripts where you've just got one or two proteins? Or, you know, was it really noticeable that there was a wide variety, a range of different ones?
Yes, I would say it was almost the other way around, because MS632 was actually our star object in that we hadn't tried this technique before, and we tried it on here and it worked incredibly well, and we found this sort of huge amount of proteins. We have looked at others now, and there is not that huge variety. We get a few, but this is clearly evidence of a very heavily used and treated document. There are other ones that don't give this wonderful information.
Yeah, that's really significant. Yeah.
I was just interested, actually, it was for Kierri really, in the sort of the grounding aspect of it. That really resonated. Sort of, I have laboured 4 times, and I think also the sort of passing on, and I can imagine it being passed on through generations, being a really, really strong sort of, I suppose, connection, and also sort of support for women in that situation, which it would have been incredibly frightening.
Yeah, definitely.
Frightening even in the 20th century when I first gave birth.
Absolutely. And so one of the kind of theorised origins of these birth girdles comes from a relic called the Virgin's Girdle. So upon the Virgin Mary's death, her body was taken up into heaven, but she sent down her girdle as proof that it was actually her. And a number of churches or cathedrals across Europe and possibly a wider area had parts of this girdle that they then loaned out to people. So we've got documentary evidence and a kind of account book from the royal family of one of the members of the royal family, you know, renting out this birth girdle when she was pregnant and about to give birth. And so, I feel like that's the kind of the most elite object, something that's got this direct connection with the Virgin Mary, and then you get birth girdles that sort of replicate that, and then they kind of keep evolving, but still in their form, they still have that kind of connection with that original object. And they were things that people would have used because, giving birth is a scary thing. As you say, 20th century, 15th century, it's still a dangerous thing. So thank you for your question.
We do have another one online, or several. First one for Kierri. I was just wondering whether you found any references to birthing girdles in medieval written sources.
So, unfortunately, you haven't got these kinds of accounts so much. One of the best ones that comes up is a sort of injunction by a church official, kind of slightly later in the period, basically telling people to stop using these talismanic or superstitious objects, and he mentions girdles as one of the things. He's called Nicholas Shaxton. And so, I guess the fact that even someone is saying stop using these suggests that they're being used. And I don't know how many people would have listened to that if they still found it a useful thing and it's something that happens in private. But unfortunately, it would be great if suddenly something crops up that's a diary entry. Dear diary, I used a birth girdle today. Sadly, we don't have that. But again, like I said, if you've got any manuscripts hiding in your attic, do let us know. Hopefully that answered the question.
Okay, another one online. This one for Sarah. They say, Sarah, I'm impressed by your research and read your article with great pleasure. Have you done similar research on medieval manuscripts and their uses?
Not yet, but it's something that we're hoping to do. So up until now, we've been mainly focused, excuse me, on the animal origins, so doing species identification and looking at sort of production quality. But after doing birth girdle with the fascinating results, it's something we want to expand into. So we're starting to do that at the moment.
Hopefully at Wellcome Collection.
Yes.
Is this on? Yes. Hello. That was so interesting. Thank you so much. My question is more for Kierri. These objects, from what you've said and other sort of research projects, seem to be a very gendered form of knowledge. And one of the things that you were alluding to was that could contribute to a form of sort of bodily autonomy at a time when that wasn't necessarily the case for a lot of women. Do we have any corresponding examples for items that were worn by men for any, obviously not birth specifically, but any other kind of ailments or anything like that in terms of sort of body and book or body and paper, parchment interaction?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And actually, I think the birth girdles, the fact that we call them birth girdles tends to kind of lead you towards thinking, they're gendered in one particular way. And it's definitely really interesting that we've got that explicit mention of birth because, like you say, kind of documentary evidence is much poorer for women than it is for men from this period. But, they do also mention things that would have been, issues for people regardless of gender, whether that's, travelling or your house spontaneously catching fire, disease of various kinds. But one of the things that I think is most kind of typically masculine is this emphasis on battle and weapons that we still get in the birth girdles. There's this really kind of clear direction that this is something that they could protect you against. And I love the idea of a birth girdle being something that's owned by a family, and you're like, oh, you're going off to battle here, you borrow it, but make sure you bring it back because, I'm going to give birth in a few months. That they were these really kinds of, multi-purpose objects. You do get recipes in recipe books that are for complaints that, might affect men more than women, whether that's kind of, reproductive issues or, kind of bodily complaints. But I think it's interesting the birth girdles aren't just for women, but they are also for women, explicitly. That's made clear.
Okay, we have another question. Oh, there we go.
Thank you, that was really interesting. I was just going to ask if we have any evidence about who might have written the content on them. Would it have been religious, sort of people in society, medical, men, women, or do we know very little?
I think, unfortunately, it's the same kind of thing, that we don't have that much useful kind of documentary evidence about their production. The printed birth girdle we know comes from a guy called Wynkin de Word, great name, who is a printer who's based in London, and that I think that's possibly the best piece of documentary evidence we've got about who produces them. But the earlier kind of parchment birth girdles, we don't really know who produced them, where they were produced. They were probably produced on commission rather than as a kind of speculative thing, because it's quite an expensive undertaking to get hold of the parchment, all of these different pigments, even writing. And I guess we think of literacy now, taught in schools, that you learn to read and write. In the medieval period, they were seen as quite distinct skills that, you could learn to read, but writing was a more kind of technical manual skill. And so you've got to get someone who's got that ability to do it. And, as we've seen in some of the pictures, some of these birth girdles are quite scribbly, and then others are these kind of beautiful sort of, I wish my handwriting looked like that, kind of calligraphy. And so, maybe if more research happens, we can find out things to a sort of greater detail, and, maybe we can kind of localize it geographically. I don't know what's possible. But yes, unfortunately, right now, we don't have as much information, but I live in hope that we'll find out more one day. Thank you.
It's not a question in the sense of, it's something I've come across, which was in northern Ghana, and men were doing a dance, which was a war dance, and we were told that they were wearing leather pouches which contain verses, which would mean that they were invisible and therefore they were protected. And my understanding is that they were Quranic verses. So you've got a link there to kind of like medieval Christianity with other cultures using protection in a similar way, and whether there are documents or evidence that could be gathered to look into, just as a sort of like, well, there's other countries that are other cultures that use this form of protection, and who knows, they might have been taken to battle and have blood on them, so there might be something more. But I just thought, well, it does make that link, so I thought I'd just mention it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, Kierri, and Elma, for the wonderful insight on birth girdle. When you said you extracted various kind of proteins from this girdle, mainly otherwise edible items like honey, oats, beans, do you think those were used during the making of the girdle, or just rubbed off while a pregnant woman or a person in labor was wearing it? Also, did you find evidences of contamination on those girdles, because they were eventually being passed down upon generations? What about contaminations and postpartum infections caused just by wearing those girdles?
Good question. So to start with, we don't know, but we don't think things like honey, beans, etc. would be used in the making of the parchment. This is not something that's routinely used, and if you compared it to our control document, none of that appeared. So it wouldn't suggest it was used during the making. It is much more likely it was used. They accrued there through the use of the object. We can't date the protein, so we can't categorically say that that's when they were deposited on there. But the fact that all of these ingredients have been documented as being used in recipes and remedies for pregnancy in medieval women would seem to indicate that is the most plausible explanation, that they were obviously using other, in addition to their birth girdle, they had other treatments going on, and then some of that would have sort of fallen onto the girdle, and some of that remains. infections, etc. I don't know. We do have evidence for bacteria on the documents. However, all documents do have microorganisms on them, as do people. The microbiome is everywhere, and something we're trying to explore at the moment is the microbiome on a parchment. Does that reflect the making of the parchment, the handling of it, or where it's been stored? And that's something that we currently don't know, and we're trying to figure out and tease out. Like, does this represent the way the parchment was made, and therefore that's the bacteria that were accrued there when it was limed and scraped, and then it never changes? Or does this bacteria come from where it's been housed in a library for many hundreds of years? So we don't know, is the short answer. But there obviously is evidence for microbiome, and it would be interesting to see if the resolution is good enough that you can see the particular species of bacteria. Then you can start to make assumptions about, are they just commensal bacteria that live there and are innocuous, they don't really do much, or do we find any strains, sort of pathogenic strains that could cause disease? And that's something, again, that we are currently and hopefully in the future going to be looking at.
I have a brief kind of addition to that, which is thinking about kind of infection and, you know, the risk of having an object like this that might be kind of dirty or messy and potentially, you know, a carrier for infection. And I don't know, again, it's just speculation as to whether this was something that happened with MS632 or any of the other birth girdles. But we do have a kind of idea that one of the ways that they could be used is that they were actually washed off in water. So parchment isn't at all like paper that we've got nowadays that, you know, just kind of dissolve. It's a really quite robust material. If anything, I guess, think of it as closer to fabric than paper. And, you know, people would kind of rinse them off, and then some of the ink might come off, or maybe just some of the kind of grubby bits that have ended up. And for some people, kind of this was used actually as a protective thing. You'd wash the ink off and then you might drink it. And so, I know it does sound a bit disgusting. So, you know, hopefully these are just some of the objects that are only used for that rather than used in these kind of messier medical contexts. But yeah, possibly they were rinsed off and, you know, cleaned, which is why, you know, it could be another reason why MS632 is so fragile, why we've lost so much of the ink, so much of the text is just completely illegible. If you see the video that is up or will be up shortly online, you can see there are sections of the manuscript where maybe there was probably ink there at some point, but you've got no hope of working out what was said. Maybe something was kind of staining there and someone scrubbed away at it, and we've lost some ink because of that.
Thank you so much. Really interesting. And the mist of time parted a little bit there, but I was wondering if there was any documentary evidence that these were actually worn. You might have said there was, but I didn't catch that. Is there any documentary evidence whether they were worn or how they were worn? Could you go and get your instructions for birth girdle? Thank you.
I mean, I'd love to find this kind of like IKEA, you know, step-by-step manual. That would be wonderful. If perhaps a bit bizarre, we were to find one from the 1400s. But yeah, as to whether there's documentary evidence, I think that, again, some of the best things we've got are these sort of injunctions telling people to stop using them, which suggests that people must have been using them or things like them. And, you know, if people are concerned about the kind of, you know, sort of spiritual implications that, particularly after the Reformation, you get a lot more kind of anxiety about the use of objects and icons. And so you've got someone saying, whoa, 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 stop using this. This is kind of verging too much into magic and too far away from what we consider as kind of orthodox religion. Then, you know, the fact that you've got to tell people not to do it suggests that people are probably doing it. As for kind of other sort of documentary evidence, there are some great things. There's a collection called the Paston Letters. It's wonderful. It's like reading some kind of medieval soap opera. It's a series of letters exchanged within a family called the Pastons. And one of the things we've got is a woman called Margaret sending a letter to her husband John, who's away, saying, please remember to wear this ring of St. Margaret that I sent you. I'm wearing something to remind me of you, and it would be lovely if you could wear this to remind you of me. And, you know, St. Margaret is one of the people who gets referenced in these birth girdles. She's also kind of known as a childbirth protector, as well as in other dangerous situations. So I know it's not strictly a birth girdle, but again, I guess it's another kind of circular object you might wear. And so maybe there's a kind of connection there. And that's, you know, an evidence that someone's using it or kind of desperately asking for someone to use it. Not for the birth girdle specifically that I found yet, but again, emphasis on the yet.
Couple of questions online. Okay, two for Kierri. I wonder if the birthing girdles were prayed over and kept in receptacles before being loaned out to the community, if owned by a church.
That's really interesting. And again, lack of documentary evidence here is the kind of obstacle. But, you know, thinking about kind of analogous objects, you know, things like relics, which might be body parts. I mean, you get things like bones or, I don't know, toenails of saints. Maybe not toenails of saints, I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that one. But yeah, those might be things that were stored in a church. Same with this kind of textile virgin's girdle that I talked about earlier. Things that would have been kept in a church, and yeah, they would have been things that people might have come to visit. And, you know, maybe you're not enormously wealthy or incredibly important so that you can actually get this loaned out to you, but maybe you can go and visit it and say some prayers. And so, you know, it becomes this kind of potent receptacle that, you know, it's in a place that's important, that's got that kind of spiritual potency, and then you've got people coming along to say prayers, maybe touch it, or at the very least kind of come near it, and they say prayers, and, you know, maybe it's kind of magnetic or sticky, all of the kind of prayers, all that sort of emotion coheres into that object, and then it gets loaned out. But, you know, at the very least, thinking of them as they're not just these kinds of intimate individual things. The same with, you know, birth generally, that, you know, now, particularly over lockdown, you've got people giving birth where they're not allowed to have anyone present, or maybe one person present. Then, you know, it's really quite a big kind of community event that, you know, all the women in the neighbourhood are going to come along and kind of check in on you while you're there in your birthing chamber, just thinking, oh, I just want a few minutes of peace. But instead, you know, they're there coming round with, oh, I've got some biscuits, I've got some tea for you. The same thing kind of with these objects, that they're community objects. They're things that people would have visited, would have prayed over, would have hopefully, you know, loaned out, rather than something that's kind of sequestered away. You know, it's not something that's hidden behind glass like the birth girdle we've got today. Yeah. Oh, there's another question.
Hi, yeah. It does occur to me that these birthing girdles, apart from being perhaps located in churches, might have been loaned out by midwives, or godsibs as they were known as in the medieval period, because midwives certainly loaned out birthing chairs. So I think that, you know, there could be quite a high probability that they loaned out these birthing girdles. I don't know what you think about that as a proposition.
Yeah. So again, like I said, we've got 9 of these English birth girdles that we know of across the world today. We've got more examples of French ones, like the one that we've got now. And there's this, you know, wonderful thing about this, a birthing kit that would have been taken around and has got, you know, various kind of useful things, maybe some things that we think of now as more medical, and some things that we think of as more kind of spiritual assistance. And I think, yeah, it's entirely plausible that part of that kit would have been a birth girdle, because it's something that's useful in that context and something that offers protection. I don't know if that's something that spread over to England. It may well have done. Again, Reformation was a nightmare for various objects being destroyed, but, you know, if we can kind of make that analogy and think of it as similar to what was happening in France and other places on the continent, then, yeah, I think that's entirely plausible. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, another one online. I'm researching late medieval English birth rituals. This is for Kierri, by the way, again, sorry. Could you discuss more the blurred boundaries between talisman and prayer role that the birth girdle inhabits?
Oh, we're really getting into it there. Yeah, I mean, I'll take anyone's options there as to, you know, is it talisman? Is it spiritual object? Can we even make that distinction? Was that kind of distinction made then? Go back again and mention these injunctions that happened kind of in the early 1600s, saying that, you know, they're no longer seen as, you know, strictly religious objects, but instead, you know, perhaps something that's accrued more of a mystical or magical status, more of a kind of talismanic artifact. And so I think partly it's kind of attitudes changing through time, and partly, you know, it really just depends on the person. That, you know, do you think of, you know, a sculpture of the Virgin Mary and Christ as a legitimate spiritual object, or do you think of that as kind of blasphemous in a way, that that's kind of iconography, that you're representing something that shouldn't be represented in an earthly form? Yeah, it's a really tricky one, and I feel like I could talk for a very long time about this kind of boundary between talisman and spiritual object. And I don't think there is a clear-cut definition at any point. I know that kind of anxieties increased kind of later in the period about usage of these sorts of objects and whether they were kind of sanctioned by the church or not. But yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with the blurred boundary. It's a very grey area.
Just checking. Okay, we do have another one online. Fortunately, it's for you again, Kierri. Are all of the known girdles decorated with the wound of Christ, and could this also be referencing the female body?
Yes, so this is a classic thing. I don't know if I can scroll back on the slides. Sorry, this is going to be me trying to... yes, this one here in particular, that you notice the one on the next slide is kind of more horizontal. This one is a vertical thing, and, you know, there's lots of scholarship suggesting that, you know, it's kind of referencing the female body, that, you know, it's emblematic of a vulva. And we've got plenty of religious interest, medieval interest in the body, you know, male and female bodies. And we get representations of side wounds, and we get representations of female genitalia. And the kind of boundary between them, can't always tell which one's which, so it may well be that kind of representation. Do we get the side wound on all of the birth girdles? Can't remember whether it's all of them, but I mean, it's definitely the majority of them. And it's something that appears in a lot of different devotional contexts. By no means is it kind of limited to birth girdles, you know, all sorts of different kind of written material. You get this depiction. It's something that has a lot of power and a lot of meaning for a medieval audience, because, you know, it was through the crucifixion that Christ redeemed all of humanity, and particularly the image of the side wound is seen as this sort of, you know, portal almost to a new sort of redeemed humanity. As to whether we can kind of compare that to medieval views on female genitalia, I'm not sure, and, you know, I feel like I'd probably hazard a guess and say that attitudes towards female sexuality weren't quite as enthusiastic about kind of redemption, but, you know, more research to be done.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I'm not very good at this. I actually have a question for Elma, if you can answer, I'm sure. How has Wellcome ended up with three of them? So I guess it's a sort of question about provenance.
Yeah, that's a really important question, to think about how these things come to be here and in other collections. So all three of the objects that we have were acquired during the lifetime of Henry Wellcome, who died in 1936. and who collected a vast array of objects from all over the world of many different kinds. These objects definitely fit into his interest in experiences of health, and also in highly rare types of artifacts. I haven't looked recently at the Prices page. It would be interesting. It's always interesting because, like various other collections around the world, we have documentation that tells us, how much was paid at the point these entered into our collection, and it helps you think about the market at that time and the value at that point. So in the first part of the 20th century, were they considered to be highly collectible at that point, or were actually there, was it that actually people were not that interested in them and they were seen as a bit peculiar, but this particular collector picked up on them? That kind of thing is always interesting to look at. But that's how they've come to be here. So as Kierri's mentioned, they are found in collections around the world, definitely in North America, as well as the British Library just up the road. And it's really interesting to think about how they've entered those collections. And also, fashions in collecting, whether they've been held onto by private collectors even now. I always like to think that there are more of this kind of object out there that we don't know about, that we're going to discover, which is still possible. So yeah, I hope that answers that a bit. Yeah.
So if anyone here or anyone online is or knows a private collector who might have one, we'd be so excited. Yeah, and it's interesting what you were saying about the kind of value that these objects held at various points. It's kind of all sorts of, horror stories for all the manuscript scholars about, people would get them for their kids to cut up and stick as a kind of rainy day activity. Go, oh, look at this nice little picture. And so, we still have that. I can't think of any immediate examples, but, all sorts of things where images are missing from manuscripts, or whole pages or whole sections missing, and whole manuscripts are going to have been destroyed because at some point they were just seen as kind of unimportant. They were old-fashioned things, and at some point attitudes changed and people thought, oh, maybe these are more valuable, maybe these are things that we can learn about. So yeah, I'd be interested to find out as well how much was paid for it, because you can kind of gauge what point sort of general kind of cultural importance was placed on it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Thank you.
No more questions online.
Okay, well, I think we should probably stop there. I think we could go on. I think there's so much to say about these objects and about the new research that's being conducted on them. I'd like to say a huge thank you to our speakers today, to Kierri Price and Sarah Fiddyment, also to Stefania Signorello, for the wonderful research that's been done and for sharing it with us. And I'd also like to warmly thank the audience here at Wellcome Collection in the room and online, because we've had a fantastic discussion that's really opened up so many of the questions around these objects and how deeply relevant they are today to thinking about our experiences of health today. That if you would like to share any thoughts on today's event, please do complete the online survey that will be sent via Eventbrite after the event. We really welcome your feedback, so any feedback that you can send us will really be valued by us. And also to say that the Exploring Research programme of events resumes in the spring. And so thank you very much. Thank you.